Today's presenter is Lauren Folche. Lauren has been working as a director of global education at Providence State School since 2007. And prior to this experience, he was a college professor who taught courses about China. Lauren has studied and lived in China in the late 80s and early 90s. He has done a lot of travel in China nearly every year over the last 3 decades. And just a side comment, during the trip that when we were traveling together, his Chinese impressed everyone, and sometimes I feel that I benefited a lot. I learned a lot from his explanations of all the insect scoop of Chinese history when we were visiting the heaven of Temple of Heaven. He pointed us to all the old bricks and shared the stories behind it. So it was a pleasure to travel with him. And the topic of this presentation is why and how the Exodus, the educational, social, political, economic, and environmental environments is driving the Chinese students to U.S. schools. Okay, then
all right.
I'll turn it over to you.
Super. Hello, everyone. I apologize again for being late. Where we had a gas leak to start things off, and I work in a library in an office, and we had to all evacuate and go somewhere else. So it's been rather chaotic. We're building a new building next door, and I guess somebody hit a gas line. So anyway, that said, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Just to start off with the slide that's right in front of you right now, it's important to have some statistical background with how many students we're talking about, and currently that number is not large with regard to students studying in American high schools. I noted here that looks a little over 30% of the students studying in the United States, period, are Chinese. And then as you go down, you'll see that a little over 35,000, although I've seen a number much higher than that recently, about 55,000 Chinese students are in American K through 12 schools. Please note that it's American K through 12, and that's interesting that one of the takeaways from this, and one of the takeaways that we as a group of students and teachers and administrators when we went to China, is the number of Chinese families who are trying to send their kids abroad at a much earlier age. And so you've seen an 11% increase just over last year with Chinese students studying in the United States, but that increase in lower and middle is actually quite large as well, and that's a whole nother conversation about how that could happen with particularly lower school kids. That said, there are not very many Chinese students in public schools, although that's greatly increasing as school districts discover that they can make a fair amount of money for bringing Chinese students in. The fee is usually anywhere from $3,000 to $10,000. The problem there is that they can only, based on U.S. law, they can only study at a public school for 1 year, and then they have to move on. So private independent schools are beginning to see a push by students and organizations to take those students, and you're going to see a lot more of that within the next few years. California has the largest number of Chinese students, no surprise, mainly in the Bay Area and also Los Angeles. Please note, just as we talk about Chinese schools, that middle school in China is grades 7 through 9. There's a little variation on the lower end of that, but most of them are grades 7 through 9, and they have over 53,000 middle schools. We're not talking about high schools. And the number of graduates of middle school in China in 2015 were 14.5 million. And just sort of think about that number, that that's a possible group, not all obviously, and maybe not even a fourth would be traveling abroad. But really it's in middle school, particularly 8th and 9th grade, where Chinese students and their families have to make a decision about whether they're going to go on and make it through the regular Chinese school system or whether they're going to go somewhere else. Let me go to the next slide. Again, you can ask questions as we go along. We don't have to hold up till the end. Probably the word exodus is a little strong, but the idea is here that there are an awful lot of Chinese students in just the last 5 years who are studying abroad, and particularly their target country is the United States. And I think it's very important for us to understand why that is the case. You know, I've had parents here at our school say, golly, I wouldn't send my child abroad for 4 years, 5 years, 2 years. And it's an interesting different culture, but what we have in China is thousands of year old Confucianist ideology, where in order to get ahead, you had to go through an educational route, a very difficult one, and gain a scholar's education. By doing that, you then had a chance to be appointed an administrator in a county, and therefore at that point you were a main person politically, legally, socially, and often they came away from that experience with a lot of money. So the whole notion of a scholar education is part and parcel to Chinese culture, and then you match that, if you will, with the one child per family, and as many parents have said to me in Chinese, education is everything. And I think, you know, there's not a whole lot of cultures that I know of in the world where many people say education is everything. You've heard of the Gaokao, or the National College Entrance Exam. 9.4 million took it in 2016. About 37% of Chinese students get into Chinese colleges, just compared to, say, 70% in the U.S. The problem here is that many don't get into the top-tier universities, and therefore they're let down. In many cases, they let their parents down by not getting in, and the status of not going to a really high-ranking school is very low. We've even seen in some cases where students will commit suicide because they didn't get into a top-tier school. A lot of pressure on Chinese students to perform and get in, and of course, just mathematically, that's not possible. It is just grueling to get ready for the Gaokao. My wife's Chinese, and it's been a while, but in order to get ready for her Gaokao, she was put into a bedroom for 1 month, and they brought in food, and she got to use the bathroom, but that was about it, because that's what you needed to do in order to do really well on the test. The last year, senior year of Chinese senior high, if you will, is entirely dedicated to teaching to the test, and teachers are ranked on how well their students do. You can make a heck of a lot of money on the side, if you will, if you're really a good teacher and can get students ready for Gaokao. I mentioned earlier, it is a make or break system for 8th and 9th graders. In other words, if they're going to apply to schools abroad, that's really the time to do it. You find 8th graders obviously applying for 9th grade. You find 9th graders applying for 9th grade, sometimes 10th. They'll repeat it in the United States. And for some students, that's really a benefit because their 9th grade there versus ours here is different in many important ways. Note that it's impossible to return to your public school once you have left. Now, you can go back and go to a private school, and we've even had a student here that's done that, but it's not like you can go back and try again. You take another year, you blend in. They travel in lockstep as a group, as a social group and an educational group in China, and in a Chinese classroom, and so it's really difficult to go back and just jump back into the school that they left, especially to get ready for Gaokao, because that's an ongoing process. And then another reason, another push out, is the Chinese parents often complain to me about rote teaching methods and just a basic didactic process. Teachers up in front, she or he is the sage on the stage. There is always a right answer. The really good students sit in front. The not so good students, at least by Chinese definition, sit in the back. When I was there watching it, I just wondered how any of those students really got support. Often they were kind of looking around the room, not quite paying as much attention as they should, but that's the way that system works. And so you have to understand that parents are realizing that while China's education has served China in some respects for quite a while, it no longer does. And we were interviewing some parents, and I have to say, in my years being in China, I have not heard such high criticism of the Chinese educational system as I did from the parents who were looking to get their kids out. All right, I only have 10 slides, so I thought this one was really neat here. So you can see the Chinese, but in English it says only 6,933 days until Gaokao. So imagine the pressure on that kid from day one. As soon as you're born, the expectation is that you will do Gaokao and you will do it well, and they're just literally marking off the days on the calendar. Another major factor, if you will, so there's the push from the Chinese educational system side, and then there's the pull of U.S. high schools here. And many of you, or all of you probably know this, that a U.S. high school diploma is a path to a potentially well-known U.S. college or university. I'm amazed that Chinese parents know the rank order of college and universities in the global rankings. They can tell you what's in Time magazine, they can tell you what's in U.S. News and World Report. Sometimes they look at some others I've never heard of, but they're well-versed, and a lot of Chinese newspapers in the United States will publish those rankings so that you know what they are. I've been to a number of parties with Chinese, and this is a topic of conversation in late spring as students are thinking about where they're going to apply, and people will say, well, Harvard's #1. I mean, everybody knows what the top 10 rankings are, and they still are U.S. colleges and universities. It does increase job chances and status. I would like to highlight that second part. If you graduate from a really high-ranking university, even if you don't get a super job, the status that comes from graduating from Harvard, Yale, or Stanford carries a lot in and of itself. And when they go back home, it's always one of the first things. Here's my son coming back. Oh, by the way, he's going to Stanford. So yeah, we have to understand it's not just the job, but it's also the status that goes with it. Note that students going back now to China, there's some new research to show that they may not be getting top-notch jobs as much as they used to. Moving forward, that may become even more difficult. And one reason is that they're kind of out of the loop of their home group, if you will, and so that network that they and or their parents had may not be working so well. And then finally, just the less stress, family pressure, and long hours of studying. I've had parents say to me, I just feel so sorry for my son or daughter that he or she has to go through this, and we know that the American system is not like that. And then finally, independent thinking and choice, but re-socialization. We've had a number of parents tell our school and me when we're talking that they really want their son or daughter to come to the United States because they'll learn how to do things like do the laundry, do the dishes, maybe even work outside, because those things are not done in China. And I always ask them, you know, you might want to reconsider how you're raising your child, but, you know, since they put so much load on a Chinese student, they really don't have to do anything else but study. You with me so far? Are you still there? Hello?
Yes.
Okay.
We're all still
Sorry.
here.
Okay, I didn't hear anything, so I don't know what to expect. And then number 3, there's, and this has been the last 3 or 4 years, particularly the last 2 years, there is a real important changing political environment that is driving parents to some degree and students to a great degree, as I found out in our last visit. So the Chinese government under the rule of Xi Jinping has been really cracking down on Western-style education. They call it ideological strengthening. And in a 2016 address, they noted, or he noted, that Chinese authorities really have to intensify ideological controls, particularly in the universities. They need to be Communist Party strongholds. It's really kind of ironic because this is really old language from the Mao Zedong era, and now it's coming back. And we could talk almost at length why Xi Jinping is pushing this, but there's a perception that the United States or Western powers, as we are referred to, are increasingly coming into conflict with China, and we want to control them. And one way of doing it is through our educational values. They just recently, the Chinese government issued a policy that bans using Western textbooks and the teaching of Western values in China's schools. And international schools recently were told that they may not use any Western material, grades 3 through 8. And I don't know, I have no sense of how well this is being implemented. You know, the government can say one thing, schools might do another, but I do know that that has sent ripples reading some of the press. I put this up there. I got this off of the internet, but I saw these in the last couple of years. These are notebooks with Mao Zedong's picture on it, and I just talk about a take back. I hadn't seen this since maybe the early 1980s, and it's just astounding how much of the sort of hardcore communist read Mao Zedong and other leaders as well are showing up in materials to try and get across the idea that we have forgotten our fundamentals. As just a sidelight, the think tanks in China, which for over a decade or so have really become much more open with research, a lot of conversation and writing between China research scholars and others, and now there's a push by the year 2030 to have Marxism, Leninism reinstalled in these places because, again, researchers, much of China's society has lost its roots. And so they're actually having to go back and read Maoist treatises, Leninist, and Marx and things like that. There is a well-known socioeconomic reason why Chinese parents are sending their kids abroad. First of all, they have the money, and you know, without that, that prevents a lot of international students from attending schools in other parts, particularly the United States, particularly independent schools, which are very expensive by most people's standards. But the middle class, which is right around 300 million now, think about that. That's about as large as our whole U.S. population. That plus urbanization, and it's one of the fastest urbanization migrations we've ever seen, come together so that by about roughly 2022, the estimate is that China's middle class could be as large as 600 million, twice the U.S. population. And what that means that you've got a family anywhere from U.S. 10,000 to U.S. 60,000 a year. A lot of that wealth currently is based on real estate. So families bought property and are still trying to do that, and with the boom in property values, and then hang on to it and then sell it off. I know a couple of families that have done that to pay for their kids' education. It's not the only way to get wealth, but it is one of the major ways. So if that bubble ever bursts, and there's been some experts saying it's got to come down some point, we will see a decline in certain families' wealth, and that may dent, if you will, students coming abroad and studying, at least studying in private schools. And then there's globalization, although, again, the Chinese Communist government is trying to put a limit on how much people can read about the rest of the world, or at least they want them to read it through the lens of Marxism. But there's just a big awareness of the world of possibilities. It's kind of interesting that every family that has sent a student to our school, they have traveled somewhere else in the world, often Europe. They may have been to 3 or 4 or 5 different countries, a few to Latin America and even to Africa, because the parents believe that the students would really gain from having that exposure. So on the one hand, they're very outward looking with that, but then the government is saying, well, that's nice, but we don't want you to see too much or reflect on that too much. I don't see that changing because, again, Chinese parents really see this as a necessary thing for their child's education. And again, that one child almost always is pampered in ways that we can't even think of here. and traveling abroad at great expense for some families is one of the ways they do it. So globalization has opened their eyes. They are still able to get information, even though the Great Wall, as it's called, on the internet prevents them from seeing CNN, BBC, and some of the more standard news sources. But I know Chinese who get a fair amount of news through the underground and in other ways. And then kind of related to socioeconomic development is the culture of this, which is to say that it's really cool to study abroad. It was exotic when I first started going to China because it was so rare. And then over time, it became a topic of conversation with middle-class families. Oh, wow, well, your kid went where? Well, they did a summer program at Hotchkiss in the United States, and then they spent a couple of weeks in Sweden. Later that following year, they went here, they went there. So it's become a stamp of higher culture in order to go and do that. But please note, there are staunch Communist Party supporters who don't think it's cool at all. And I've heard some people that I know in a city called Nanjing, where I stay a lot, say, look, we don't need our students going abroad, they need to stay here. So not everybody accepts this coolness, if you will, but there's enough to keep promoting a wide range of students traveling outside China. And then the fifth reason here, the picture I think tells it all. If you've been following the press or if you've been to China at all recently, just the amount of smog, the amount of pollution in China, it's gotten outrageous. I mean, even the Chinese newspapers have noted that. And this is Shanghai looking out the Jinmao Tower. I want to note here that this is not all that bad compared to Beijing at different times. There isn't a city now in China that doesn't have pollution in some way, shape, or form, at least not on the East Coast anyway. And so I've heard parents say, my kids have to get out of here because this is bad for their health. There is a lot of material and even talk show discussions on Chinese television about how bad the pollution is for their children, and there's data to back that up. The common saying is you will lose 5 years of your life if you live in a city that's really polluted. So Chinese parents are noting this and saying, I don't want my young child affected by this, and we know that America is much cleaner, or Canada, or UK, or Australia. So it has become one of the factors for why Chinese would like to get their children out and studying somewhere else. And then finally, so if you think back about the current exodus and things that I've mentioned, the various factors, just to reiterate, path to U.S. colleges and universities is perceived to be, if you come to the United States and start studying in high school, even better if you do it in junior high or middle school, you're going to go to a college or university. Not everybody's going to go to Harvard, even though that seems to be one of the major goals, but you will get into a college and university. And so coming in earlier is better than going in later. In the old days, just even 15 years ago, most Chinese students came in to go to college and weren't going to high school, and that was a real jump for them because the work in college was way over their head. It was really, really difficult. So they've found an easier way to do that. Speaking of easier, I often hear that the academic environment in the United States high schools is, whether public or private, is much easier. And if you talk to your students and say, okay, we know you're studying really hard and we know that you're doing it in a different language, but is this easier than in China? Almost always they will say, yeah. There's a lot to do here, but there's not that pressure that I had before. They have the freedom to make choices in and out of school. Families are seeing that the ability for a student to choose his or her path, what industry they want to go in, what discipline they want to study, that's really limited in China. You have to decide what you want to study before you go to college, and changing your major in college is possible, but very, very difficult, and changing broadly or way different than what you are planning to study is even harder. So not much choice, not much freedom, and that freedom in intellectual respects is being closed down or attempted to be closed down by the Chinese government. So you put that into the hopper and you can understand why the ability to go somewhere else and have that freedom. Potentially better job opportunities. I mentioned earlier, though, this is changing. Chinese are going back. Often they are not able to get a job here. Companies, in fact, this is going to increase with the current U.S. administration because it's harder to immigrate. And if you're not part of the HB process, getting your work permit, then it may be even more difficult as time goes on. So they'll end up going back, but they won't necessarily get the job that they thought of, although China's government's now offering a really great package with regard to housing and other things for those who don't go back. And then finally, I mentioned clean air for children. All right, I'm going to stop there. I haven't been watching my watch. I should have, but just see if you have any responses or questions.
Okay. Thank you so much, Lauren, for your very insightful presentation with a lot of good data. Some of them are really new information for me to learn as well. It's such a great, like a comprehensive overview of what has driven Chinese students to study in the U.S. So let's open up to Q&A section. So, audiences, we welcome you to type in your answers in the chat box, and we will read it out loud for you. And to get it started, I will throw in the first question.
Okay, don't make it difficult now.
No, I'll try, but okay. I'm really curious because we've all seen the changing paradigm and a big influx of Chinese students in the U.S. Through my personal experience and also been reading some data, a lot of these international students have plans to come back to China. And also you mentioned about getting a job in the U.S. is not easy, and there's big incentive of attracting overseas talents from the Chinese
Correct.
Government side. So my question is, with their experience studying in the U.S. and the education they get, all the mindset change and cultural influences, what do you think are the possible future impacts on China's society? It sounds like a big question. Yeah.
But that is a great question, and it's the $64 million question now. I don't know if I have a great answer for it because there's a lot of thinkers out there. You know, 30 years ago, even 20, when experts on China were talking about change, one of the arguments was, you know, Western culture was going to go into China and have a major impact. We have 1989 as a result of that. And then another argument was, well, if a lot of Chinese students leave and go abroad, they're going to get westernized, and when they go back, it's going to be hard for them to reintegrate and accept the current culture. And I do know from very anecdotal experience that that is true. It's hard because you really have been, if you will, affected by Western culture, the values, particularly being able to say what you want to say, do what you want to do. That's pretty easy now in China. If you have money, you can do virtually anything. So I don't think that is, unlike the old days, I don't think that is as much of an effect, but it's more the mind part of it. And just going back into a population, like if you've been living in Missouri or something like that for 4 years, going back into a really, really jam-packed society, I've seen people say, well, I just can't handle this. I'm not used to being around so many people at one time. So there's a social component to it, and then also an intellectual one. And I don't know, I think it's a little early to say this is going to lead to, you know, a collaborative effort to try and change the government, but one would expect that down the road. On the other hand, if you're going to get a job in China, you have to conform. I mean, it's not like you can walk up and work for a corporation and say, you know, I really hate China, you fill in the blank, and expect to work there very long, because as you well know, every unit in China has a Communist Party in an office somewhere, and that's true in every school, in every workplace. And so there's limits to how much you can complain. When I mentioned earlier, what the research now shows is that Chinese students studying abroad, when they go back, they've left their network, or what the Chinese call guanxi wang, and without that network of friends, colleagues, parents' connections, it's hard to do business, because if you don't know somebody in China, it is hard to get things done. Yeah, that has been around in China for I don't know how long. So I think they're going to have some difficulty. I do have a friend, he's a bit older than a student, but he brought his family back. His kids tried to go to school in Shanghai, even in an international school. It wasn't even in a local public school, and they just said they couldn't handle it, and so they moved back to the United States, even though he's making less money now than he was in Shanghai. So that's just one story, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were others.
Yeah, thank you. This is a great answer, and I can definitely resonate with the reverse culture shock part.
Yeah.
When I
wanted to ask you that.
I was like, wow, that's a lot of people. Okay,
Right.
so I got a question from Tina, and I'll just read it out loud. Tina asks, what do you find is the biggest challenge to change the mindset of study to test that some of the Chinese students still have after they came here? And what do you even think it needs to be changed?
Right. You know, if I have a really good answer to that question, I'll be rich tomorrow, because there's so many schools that are facing this. No, joking aside. So let me give you what we do here, and I do think it's working, even though we don't have a large Chinese student population. So in order to come to Providence Day School, we require every student, first of all, in the 9th grade, they're not allowed to take an AP class. And we're very much AP driven. I don't know about your other schools that are online here, but when Chinese first come here, the first thing they want to do is take a lot of APs, because they've prepped for some of them, their parents are pushing them hard. So first of all, we tell them no APs at the 9th grade. We'll allow one AP for the sophomore year if you're an entering sophomore. So we don't allow them to jump into a really fast-paced course. I'm not necessarily intellectually challenging, but so fast-paced that they would have a hard time staying up with it. Another thing we do is that we require them to participate in a sport or performing arts. And that takes, first of all, that gets them out into our student community really well, and begins to get them to realize that being around others has a benefit to it. And then the other thing we've been preaching in the last 2 or 3 years, and sharing articles with everyone we possibly can, that study crave, if you will, really doesn't necessarily have a payoff. I mean, the research now, colleges and universities, there was just a thing by, what was it, the president of Stanford, I think, who said, you know, APs are not the end-all to be-all. If you've taken 5 or 6, all right, that's enough. If you take a lot more, it just doesn't count. And so I think we need colleges and universities who are saying that to, you know, let us know and then encourage us to share it. So taking the AP heat off is helped to some degree, and then just telling them over and over again that their path to success is not necessarily through the book. They have to carve out their own uniqueness, which is not necessarily tied to a GPA. And 20 years ago in the United States, yeah, if you had a really high GPA, you came here and did nothing but study. Even 10 years ago, you could get into a really top-tier university. That's no longer the case. The numbers just don't bear that out. So we've been preaching here over and over again, you've got to create your own story, and if your story is only about a high GPA, that story's not enough to get you in. And we have some students who graduated from here, and they did well. We've had a couple real high flyers, but it wasn't because necessarily of their grades. It was their grades, and one was a fantastic piano player, as an example, and so went on to a school where she's still playing piano because she's very passionate about it. So we do some things that on our home base here that require them to spread out and make connections elsewhere that will help develop their story. Like, wow, I was in a play last year, here's the role that I played, and I took a leadership role in helping build the set or something like that. We have students that are now doing that. So I would encourage every independent school, even though we can't force anyone, to start pushing that idea, because if you only have students who want to study hard, that's what they've done. That's what worked so well in China. And so it's like us. If we go to China and we're plopped into the school system there, we would be expected to stay at school from 7:30 until 5 every single day. We would be with the exact same class, the same cohort, day after day after day. And then in the evening, we would go and we'd spend all our time memorizing. And we would go nuts. I mean, I went to a university for a while in China, and it was a little bit like that. And I have to say, you can only handle it for so long. So you think about the reverse, that's what Chinese students are bringing to our doorstep, because that has worked in China for thousands of years, just learning through rote memorization, swallowing the book, if you will, spitting out the answers. But students are beginning to learn that that doesn't work every time. And so our educational systems are changing, where we're beginning to require more creative thinking. And we've had some Chinese students here who haven't done very well academically, particularly with creative writing. And so that's another thing, is we haven't quite forced them to take a creative writing course, but we have learned when Chinese students do that, that's really a challenge for them. It gives them the freedom on the one hand, and sometimes they don't know what to do with it. And then secondly, it really pushes them to realize that there's a great expanse of thinking out there, and you can be part of that. You can be writing your own story. So I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but that seems to work for us. And I think the landscape, the paradigm, if you will, is changing, obviously, in American education with regard to college admissions, and Chinese students are a part of that. And what used to work no longer works. It doesn't work for us so well as it used to, and so Chinese students, my guess is in the next 10 years, Chinese families will begin to really push the idea that you need to be very versatile and write your own story. At least that's what some of the parents that I've talked to in Shanghai, as an example, they really think it's important for their kid not to study all the time. Not to say that all parents are like that, but particularly the ones in the big cities are beginning to see that that is not the only path. Okay, long-winded answer again, sorry.
Okay, great. And the next question is from Walter.
Yeah.
He asked, given the cost, I guess, of studying and living in the U.S., aren't we really talking about those high-income families? He's probably referring to the slides when you given a range of middle class, saying their annual income is between 10K to 60K.
Right,
so,
right. That's a great question. So I should have explained earlier. So this money comes from different sources. So I know families, for instance, that borrow money from their relatives. Uncle, has got some apartment or a condominium, if you will. He can borrow off of that, take a loan out on it. What you'll learn about the Chinese economy and Chinese society is that the money reported is not always what they have. In fact, I have yet to know a family that actually reports their true income. So they get it from various sources, and the families that were able to, again, buy property earlier, some of that property has gone up like 1,000, 2,000% in places like Shanghai or Beijing or Nanjing. So it's not just a little bit of property gain, it's a huge one. And then other families, again, are barely getting by. We have a student right now whose family is very middle class, works for a company. I know they're not like some of the other families that send their kids here, and they're borrowing money from other sources. So can you imagine that student's getting a lot of pressure from the parents going, look, I'm borrowing this for your sake, so you better do well. And she is, but she is on the side of I got to study all the time, and trying to get her loose from the books has required us to say on the weekends, you cannot go to your room for a certain number of hours. And that's literally what we've said. And the host family has been good in following through on that. So, and you get into conflict with the Chinese parents. Look, this is what I want my son or daughter to do versus what we're trying to get them to do here. You know, you got to work on a balance on that. But that's a great question about the money. And of course, if the Chinese economy doesn't keep chugging along, it was steaming along for a while, and now it's slowing down a tad. Some of that wealth may not be continual, but in the foreseeable future, it's supposed to be. That's the general prognosis. Okay.
Good, great. Next question from Kathy. From your research, what percentage of Chinese students who study in the U.S. end up actually going back to China to get jobs in China? And the second part of the question is, are there things that we can do as high school teachers to help them and support them who plan to go back?
Right. Great question. I was trying to look for that data. I wasn't able to find it. I figured somebody was going to ask that, so really great question, like they all have been. And it's probably in somebody's report, but I don't know. I do know, you know, Homeland Security would have the kind of data, would have that data to show how many students, international students, are accepted into the workforce here, and they probably have an ethnic breakdown of that, but I just don't know where that data is. I do, just from, again, watching and looking at anecdotal evidence, most of them end up going back now. So it's different than for a while, particularly after 1989, everybody who got out of China at that time period got to stay here. But that's not necessarily the case. And again, our laws require a student to find a job, and the company has to seek out and follow a procedure for getting that person a work permit. And again, and under the current administration, I think it's going to become a lot more difficult. You're going to have to really show that you need that Chinese person as opposed to an American. And this is happening to students from India. There was a thing right after President Trump was elected about some congressperson was saying we need to reevaluate who's coming into our country to work when we should be giving these jobs to Americans. The only problem with that is, you know, do we have enough Americans who are educated in the ways that these companies want, or are they just going after cheap labor? So I don't know the number. And the other problem is that the company has to spend a fair amount of money in order to make that happen. So like a teacher in Charlotte, for instance, will cost a school about $5,000 in order to get a green card or work permit, I'm sorry, to stay here. And that was about 3 years ago. Maybe that price has gone up now. So what Chinese students do in order to stay here as long as they can will go to college, university, and then they'll go to graduate school, and then they'll try and get a PhD. So you have this really big push on the part of Chinese students to keep going up the Chinese ladder for a variety of reasons, but it also keeps them here. What was I reading the other day? That 3 out of 5 physics PhDs at UC Berkeley are with Chinese students, and they're trying to stay in school however long they can, and then after that they have an internship period. I think it's 1 year where they can still stay on, and then after that, if they don't have a work permit, I presume that they have to go back. But I don't have the figures on it, and I would like to know that, so I'll spend some time digging it. Okay.
Very interesting answer. Thank you. And the last question comes from Fanny. He said, thanks for sharing, Lauren. And from her experience of working with Chinese students, quite a number of them are under a lot of pressure. They started to realize how important extracurricular activities are for creating their stories and uniqueness. But at the same time, they also have a tendency to achieve a perfect GPA because they know that they're in a less advantageous position in terms of college application compared with their U.S. cohort. What do you think school can do to help them relieve some of the pressure?
Yeah, we certainly have it here, and one of the things we have is we have a upper school counselor, and Amy is part of our 6-person China team, as we call them, and she and our academic counselor work hand in hand to try and identify that, and I mean, have conversations. You've got to allow Chinese students a place to have a conversation about that and express themselves. I guess I'm fortunate that I speak Chinese, so sometimes when I'm talking to them, we can have that conversation about, wow, how you feeling? I know you're under a lot of pressure. We got exams coming up. Really, you know, you got to take care of your health. That's one of the things we've been blasting lately, is that it's not worth bad health if for all of these A's that you want. So there's no good answer. I don't think there's an excellent answer to this because, again, you're running against a cultural grain. Going back to my earlier comment, if we went to China, think about all the troubles we would have, and probably the angst, if nothing else, of just trying to survive in a Chinese classroom. So we have to be very empathetic with that and understand that when they come here, not all of them, but a good share of them will continue that path, because that, again, is what works. That's what their parents are pushing. And I'm really thankful for NOIE, just because, you know, you do have people in your office who are working as intermediaries to try and balance that out. I just think it's going to take some time. Because we've been accepting Chinese students here now for, well, I guess about 6 years. Well, I've been here 10. Yeah, about 6 years. And we didn't have any agency before. We did it all on our own. And I've seen some burnout kids. We just didn't even know how to identify it. I knew what it was like in China, but once they got here, being very proactive and talking with them, telling them, please don't take 6 APs. We have a limit on the number of APs that we allow students to take, and we've just recently had a Chinese student reduce the number of APs because she was really feeling the pressure, and we just said, this is not healthy, right? So I think administrators have to jump in and say, for your best health, and we would do this with American students, you really shouldn't do this to yourself. And I don't think, I just don't know, but my guess is that schools probably feel a little reticent to try and do that, but we're their parents in some way across the sea, and we all have a responsibility, like we would with our local students, to give them the best environment for their future, not what they have already self-defined. So again, Amy, our our upper school counselor, talks with them pretty often. We also, I highly recommend every 2 weeks we bring them together for lunch with some Chinese food. I'm fortunate to live in Charlotte, so there's a couple of decent restaurants, but even if they're not decent, just something, even the American Chinese version, we get them together and they talk a lot amongst each other about their challenges and whatnot. And we now have a rising senior who is kind of reversed from where she was before and is saying, you need to take it a little bit easier. You need to understand that getting into college is not all A's. So Chinese students can help each other out if you give them a venue where they can vent and talk amongst themselves. And we do that before the students even begin classes. We spend a week with them, and we have the veterans, as we call them, talk to the incoming, and we tell them, your spiel needs to look like this because we want the best for these students, and just killing yourself for the A is not the best for these students. So my guess is, like, in another 4 or 5 years, you're going to see less and less of this, although as a cultural habit, it's just not going to go away anytime soon. It's like trying to take away our freedom of choice or something. We might be able to do it at some point, but we would fight it tooth and nail just because it's so ingrained in us. All right.
Great. Thank you so much, Lauren. That was it was a lot of good suggestions and creating some safe environment and venues for Chinese students to support each other, especially bringing the food piece. Oh my God, it's the biggest comfort and the quickest way to help students open up to each other.
Yeah, it's a small thing. It doesn't cost a whole lot. It's a small thing, but when I lived in China for a while, I started wanting a McDonald's hamburger so bad, and I'm not a big McDonald's eater, right? But at some point you're going, oh my God, I gotta have a McDonald's. And so when my Chinese hosts would say, let's take you out some for, quote, Western food, I was ecstatic about it and said, okay, you recognize that we have a different cuisine and that we long for things, and thank you very much for thinking of us. So I guess what we're doing more and more is trying to come up with those little things. We're going to start a Chinese movie night, I think it's the week after next, where we're renting Chinese movies and just getting together with some popcorn, and we're saying you need to attend this, and you can teach us, what's being shown on the big screen, if you will. So addressing their culture, giving them a chance to live their culture instead of expecting them to become entirely American, which I think is really quite unfair. These are little things that don't cost a whole lot that can create community and connections between you and Chinese students, which then gives you more ability to say, getting straight A's is okay, but, you really need to work on your story, and balancing your life is really important. So if you haven't connected with them, except as an administrator or a teacher, in a very formal way, it's hard to get your point across, as we all know. But if you trust one another and feel comfortable talking with one another, you're more likely to listen. So I just encourage you to think of those little things and think of what it would be like if you were living somewhere else like China. What would you want? And then apply it to our own home setting. I'll get off the air because you're probably bored hearing this, but please feel free to contact me. I'm not sure how I can get you the information, but I'm at Providence State. You can go online, and I think my information's there. And anytime we can have these conversations to help each other out, I just think it's really a great thing. We've improved so much compared to where we were 5 years ago, and there's always room for improvement.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for incredible sharing, Lauren, and also for the excellent questions that we got. It's really a very meaningful conversation, very interesting. I hope it's helpful for anyone that works directly with Chinese international students. And we also welcome you to join the next webinar. The topic is Lost in Translation, talking about the key classroom differences that U.S. educators need to know when they're welcoming Chinese students into their schools. And it'll be presented by Catherine Cox. Catherine is an ELL teacher at Gaston Day, together with Robert Means. Robert is the Director of Global Program at Greensboro Day. Looking forward to having you tomorrow.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much. It was nice to talk at you. I'd love to talk with you sometime.
All right. I'll be typing up Lauren's email address to the text box, if you don't mind, Lauren.
Don't, by all means, please share. I'd love to find out how everybody else is doing.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. All right, 再见. Goodbye in Chinese. 再见.
Bye-bye. Thank you.